This is part 24 of my series on my N-gauge model railway project. Previous parts cover the project from its inception through the creation of the baseboard, selection and laying of track, building of scenic items, obtaining rolling stock, etc. The project is ongoing. Recent parts have also featured actual video of running on the layout and more to come, but not in this part. This part deals with building a Peco 9-foot wagon kit. I bought several of these Peco wagon kits from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario recently. Some of them are based on the 9-foot chassis and others on the 10 or 15-foot. The two versions produce a very different kit, as with the 10 and 15-foot kits the chassis essentially comes pre-assembled, whereas the 9-foot chassis has to be assembled from several parts which come on a couple of black sprues. The particular kit I am assembling here is KNR 208, the 9-foot Iron Ore Tippler. Although they're all of the 9-foot kits will be fairly similar. The instructions that come with the kit are very generic, basically one small piece of paper on one side of which is instructions for the 10 and 15-foot wagons and the other side the 9-foot wagons, so only one side of the paper will apply to the particular kit you are building. What you see here is everything that comes with the kit. 2 black sprues to build the chassis, including the coupling pockets, 2 grey sprues, in this case colour varies for other wagons, with the parts for the wagon body, a bag with a metal weighting sheet and the couplings and axles with wheels, and the single sheet of instructions. And that's what you can see on that piece of paper there is all the instructions you get. I'd never built these kits before, and one screaming omission from my point of view was that no indication was given as to what type of glue should be used for assembly. I know from experience that using the wrong type of glue can lead to complete failure when working with a plastic kit, so I really wanted to be sure that I knew what I was working with here. From some research on the internet, but not from Peco's own set, I managed to find that these kits are in fact made from styrene plastic, so liquid polycement can be used for assembling them and will indeed be the best thing. I believe that the couplings and axles are in fact made from a different type of plastic, but that doesn't matter as those parts should not be glued at all. The first thing to do, as is normal with plastic kits, was to carefully cut the parts from the sprues. The quality of manufacture was excellent, with sharp detail and very little flash. Once cut from the sprues, I cleaned up the parts, basically removing what little flash there was and the remains of the sprue connection points, mainly using an emery board as sold for manicure use. The instructions are less than clear. In fact, they are downright vague about everything except how the chassis goes together. It was pretty clear that 2 pieces would make the base of the wagon and that the metal weighting plate should go between these 2 pieces. The walls of the body need to line up, in the case of this wagon, the ridge going at the bottom of each section. Once the walls are assembled, the floor will rest on that ridge. It's less than obvious exactly how the walls should fit together at the corners. Basically, the short end wall butts up against the end of the long side wall, with a little flange at the end of the side wall going over the top of the end wall, as you can see here when these two joined. The metal plate goes into the recess in the bottom base piece, no need to glue that at all, and then the top base piece glues onto the top of that, with 4 locating pins clearly guiding it into its proper place. I glued the walls together like this, doing pairs of side and end walls first, and then gluing the 2 pairs together. Obviously, you need to be careful to get the assembly square. Once the walls are assembled, the base can be dropped in from the top and pushed down until it rests on the ridge round the bottom. Another approach would have been to assemble the side walls around the base. Would that perhaps have been better? You have to make up your own mind, because the instructions give no guidance. The large ribs on the base are essentially part of the chassis and go on the bottom. The smoother side faces up. I have no idea what the 2 rectangles in the middle represent. It is very important to make sure that the base sits properly down on the ridge at the bottom of the walls. If the base isn't fitted properly, the couplings won't work properly. Here is the view from the bottom after gluing in the base. As noted, there should be no gap between the base and the ridges at the bottom of the walls. Now let's turn to the assembly of the chassis, which is fairly clearly covered in the instructions. Here are the pieces for the 9-foot chassis once they've been taken off the sprue. Note that the 3 little round pieces on the bottom of the brake hangers are just casting aids. They should be removed before assembly. I'd really be happier if this kind of thing was clearly stated in the instructions. Here are the brake hangers after removal of the casting aids, ready for gluing to the other parts. The recesses in the brake hangers fit over the pins in the side pieces, which are apparently called sole bars. Here's how the side pieces fit together. I use Q-tips to wipe off excess glue. Next, the buffer beams fit to the ends of the sides, completing the frame of the chassis. The fit here is quite positive, with little tabs on the buffer beams fitting into grooves on the ends of the sides. Here's a buffer beam fitted to a side piece. It does tend to sit square quite well, which is good, as having the frame square is important. Now the other chassis side is glued to the buffer beam. Q-tip shown, as said before, for removing excess glue to keep things looking tidy. And finally the other buffer beam is glued in place and the square up of the frame checked. Once the chassis frame is complete, it is glued onto the base of the wagon body. There were no specific guide pins or flanges for this with this particular kit, so it was necessary to carefully eyeball getting the chassis frame square and central on the body. The holes in the body base, which were for fitting the 2 base pieces together, give a helpful guide as to whether you have the chassis properly centered. You can see at each end of the base the 2 holes coming through, and obviously you want the ends of your chassis to be the same distance from those at both ends. And of course, looking at the fit of the chassis from the outside of the body is a useful check. Now it's time to fit the final and most important parts, the couplings and the wheels. Obviously, if these aren't fitted correctly, the result will be no use as a running wagon. The couplings need to be fitted with the pins pointing down, as seen here. That is, the little pin that comes out of the bottom of the coupling needs to point downwards, not upwards. The couplings drop into the coupling pocket, and then the small retaining piece fits in on top. The instructions give measurements as to where the couplings are supposed to fit, which honestly I found incomprehensible. What is all that 220, 130 stuff? Scale inches? Anyway, it didn't seem really necessary to figure out what the numbers in the instructions meant, as the coupling pockets fit in between the 2 little flanges on the end of the chassis, and basically just fit in between the end piece of the chassis and the ridges on the body base. So there really isn't any question where to put them. They basically fit tightly in there with pretty much no wiggle room. In fact, you have to push them a bit to get them in. Here's the other end before fitting the coupler pocket, and you can see quite clearly where the coupler pocket is going to go, between the 2 black bars coming out the back of the buffer bar, and in between the buffer bar and the ridges on the base. And it just fits snugly into that space. For proper functioning, it's very important that the couplings normally rest horizontally but can be pushed up. So when you put the wagon upside down, the coupling should naturally fall to be angled towards the top of the wagon like this. If the couplings don't fall like this when the wagon is placed upside down, either the couplings are binding in the pockets or the pockets are fitted too high relative to the chassis. Presumably because the wagon's floor isn't fitted low enough, i.e. isn't sitting down properly on the ridges at the bottom of the walls. Conversely, when the wagon is upright, the couplings should sit horizontal. If they stick up, they are either sticking in the pockets, which shouldn't happen, so long as you take care not to get any glue inside the pockets. On the other hand, if the couplings droop, this will be because the little inserts in the pockets aren't holding them properly. Either you forgot to put the inserts in, or they're not pushed down flush into the top of the pockets. Wagons won't couple properly if their couplings droop, and I've bought several used wagons where this was the case, and fixing was necessary in order to use the wagons. The next step is to fit the axles with the wheels. Basically, you just need to get the point on one end of the axle into the hole in the chassis piece, and you can quite clearly see the hole at the top left of this picture for the other end. Then once you've got one point into its hole, you can push down on the other end of the axle until its point snaps into the hole on the other side. It's a bit fiddly to do this, as the coupling pocket gets in the way somewhat, but I think it is probably best to do the couplings first and then the wheels, as if you did it the other way, the axles would really get in the way of fitting the coupling pockets. Here again you can see the hole where the point on one end of the axle needs to go. Once the axles are in, just run your fingers over the wheels. If the points are in the holes properly, the wheels should turn smoothly and easily, and if you stand the finished wagon up, it should roll easily with a slight push. If it doesn't, then you're going to have to fiddle with the axles until you get the points into the holes properly. It is quite easily to push them in, but not have them quite in the holes properly. But you need to get those points on the end of the axles sitting nicely into the holes, and then everything should turn easily. And here are the two wagons of this type that I assembled, showing how their couplings engage properly so long as they're both sitting horizontally. Obviously all I've done here is just a very basic assembly. If you're going to paint, detail and weather the wagons, it would likely be easier to do some of that work before fitting the bodies to the chassis. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with these wagons, but I'm quite pleased with how they went together, and I will be building some more Peco wagon kits.